Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the Thinking Athlete podcast. My guest this time is going to be none other than Sam Spineli, who, other than being my coach, is a doctor in physical therapy and also a co founder of two companies, one of which is called E3 Rehab and the other being Citizen Athletics. Citizen Athletics focuses more on the fitness and performance side of things, while E3 Rehab focuses more on the rehabilitative side of things. Now, we started the conversation, and somewhere after the first couple of minutes, I've noticed that the recording button didn't go off. So, what you're about to hear is right in the middle of things, where I asked Sam how did he manage to train and, in general, how his life looked right after everything happened with COVID-19. I hope you enjoy watching it. So without further ado, let's begin.
About those movements. And so I tried to make do with what I could. The gym that I was at gave me some equipment, and they said, like, you can take it home and do whatever you can. So I would load up my equipment into my truck, and then I would drive out to some empty place, and I would put mats down, and that way I could snatch, that way I could clean and jerk because I can't at my house. And I would drive home, use my squat rack, squat and do whatever I could. It was going fine. I'm like really appreciative that I had the ability to do that. But the training was just like, it didn't feel right. I was all over the place. I was like very frustrated with the conditions that I was under, and just like, because of COVID, I had to then also start changing the way I was working and figuring out new solutions to generate some new income, and also see my businesses have a turn. Because like, if I assume most of the people listening are in the fitness industry, like everything basically tanked. Like, I had most of my individual clients essentially say, "Hey, I've got no access. Like, I appreciate what you can do for me, but really, like, to pay you the fee that you normally do just to do some like lame home workouts, I'm not that interested in it." And then my rehab clients, a lot of them were like, "Hey, I have no access to anything. What can you do?" So then I had to get very creative with a lot of things. And then for my two main businesses, it was like, okay, well, Citizen Athletics is essentially just providing training services to people that go to gyms. So we had a huge drop, and then it was like, well, I better figure out some solutions. So then I started making home workouts, and then that drove into like building this huge home muscle building program. And then for E3 Rehab, it was like, okay, well, a lot of the programs that we offer currently utilize gym equipment, and people don't have that. So then how can we build stuff that's going to be a good, viable program for people to utilize from a rehab standpoint for these different things that doesn't require any equipment? And so then me and my business partners then built 8 new programs for different things that require no equipment. All that was like a huge stress on me because we were trying to get it done stat. And so my training took like a huge dive, huge backseat. I would like come down to my basement, put my bar in the rack, try to squat, get frustrated because I knew that I had a ton of work to do, get like 1 or 2 sets done, do 1 or 2 sets of pressing, go upstairs and start working. And for me, it was like really hard because I had no divide between where I live, where I work, where I train. All of these things were mixed in one. And to be able to step away after I'd already been working, probably like there was days where I'd wake up at 5 a.m., start working, and then my wife and my daughter would wake up. I'd spend like 10, 15 minutes with them, get back to work, and then work essentially until my daughter was going to bed, and then try to train afterwards. My wife get upset because I'd literally not stopped working all day. And so it training took a big backseat for a while, which for me is unusual. Like, I've essentially never had a time in my life where I've trained so little for so long. And the last like 2 weeks I've gone back into a groove where work has figured out some things and it's back to a little bit more normal-ish. I am now just doing essentially like primarily a body weight based program, which is a lot easier because in contrast, when I was, as I'm sure you can understand, if I had to come in and I had to squat, 3 sets of 8 at 200 kilos, I was going to have to warm up for a while. Like, you don't just come in and do that. And in contrast, like, I can just come downstairs and I can just start doing single leg squats. I can start just going into push-ups. I don't have to do like a 15, 20-minute warm-up to be prepared to do that. And so that really allowed me to expedite the time that I spent training. Like right now, I'm training roughly every single day, but it's only for like 45 minutes. And they're 45 good minutes, which I'm really appreciative for. Because before it was like I would spend 30 to 45 minutes and I would not be happy with what I was doing. I'd be really frustrated. And so yeah, that's my current training.
Does it look more like circuit training or just normal straight sets, but it just takes you like half of the usual training you usually do?
So I made this home muscle building program, Assistant Athletics, for exclusively stuff that you have around your house. And when I laid it out, I made it so that it was like roughly between 7 and 8 movements per day. And the first 4 movements are meant to be, you do it, sit down and rest, repeat until you've done all the sets. Then you move on to the last ones, which are then in a circuit format. I've changed it up a little bit just so that like I'm a little bit more of an advanced trainee and I can tolerate supersetting to a higher degree. So I've put the first 2 movements together, then the second 2 movements together, and then I go through it. So usually that looks like where I do like a squat and a pull, a press and a hinge, and then I get into like the accessory movements. So I've been supersetting, but I still rest between them. So normally it's like a 1-minute rest, do the other movement, 1-minute rest, do the other movement, back and forth for like 3 to 4 sets, and then repeat that until I get done probably per day around 12 to 15 sets total.
All right. And obviously, the primary work that you do is with athletes and people who are looking for rehab. Is there a certain preference that you have with the people that that you kind of work with?
So I wouldn't say that I inherently preference this population. Like I definitely really enjoy weightlifters. Because I am a weightlifter, I find the coaching side of things very fun. I find that the rehab side of things is not that complicated from a standpoint of the demands of the sport. It's not one that it sees a lot of like odd injuries or very challenging ones to manipulate variables for. Like it's relatively easy to change the variables that are necessary to have positive success in rehab quite easily from a standpoint of the way that I treat. I'm like a very big capacity, tolerance, managing load kind of physical therapist. So then those are things that I can do relatively easily, and I can change movements quite easily. Like they're not highly dynamic ones that have a ton of different variables. Whereas I also work with a lot of high level swimmers, and I'm very fortunate that I've got like 3 people that are planning to go to the Olympics whenever that happens. And for that population, it's a lot harder because like right now I have one person who has knee pain, and she has knee pain with one specific type of stroke, but it happens to be her competitive stroke. And so it does make it a little bit more complicated when, there's a lot more variables that happen because it usually requires a higher rate of speed. It has a higher complexity. There's more things involved in it. And then when I get into other sports that have like, other players, I also work with a lot of soccer players here locally. And for those people, it's not just them. They have other people that are on the pitch, and those are and more variables to start to include. So weightlifting is like a fun one because I can really focus on a lot of things that I have control over. Whereas with my soccer players, when we're doing like return to play, like I just helped one return back from a conservatively managed ACL tear. And for her, when she was coming back, we had a lot of concern about, okay, well, what happens if another player comes and does a slide tackle? What happens if another player comes in and cuts her off and tries to steal a ball, and then she ends up being forced into a valgus position? Like, what are we going to do in these different situations, and how can we start to prepare for them? Whereas in weightlifting, like, you don't have that. It's just like, okay, you're gonna snatch up to 50% today. Cool. So, yeah, like weightlifting is is a one that I have a lot more knowledge probably in. Whereas, when I started working with swimmers, I'd never done that before I moved here. And that was one I had to do a ton of research in because I had very minimal sports specific knowledge. So when I started to, what demands are they going to experience in a butterfly versus a freestyle? Like I had very little knowledge on that. Whereas, the differences between a snatch balance, a snatch drop, like that's my bread and butter. So I love weightlifting.
Now, when you started working with swimmers, that's where the prone infinities came into play.
Actually, I like fell in love with the first time I started utilizing those was there's the more traditional standard movement is just a prone horizontal abduction, which is one of the movements that shows the highest elicited activation of the infraspinatus muscle. And so I started off just like utilizing those to a higher degree when I was working as a strength and conditioning coach, and that progressed into this one called a prone angel hover, which is then going up into a higher degree of shoulder elevation. And I really dug that movement. And once you started to, like for me, I started to include it where I come down and have my palms turn up to the roof at my lower back. I started to see that that was a good way to get comprehensive shoulder rotation in a dynamic movement. And I was like, well, that's a really beneficial thing to do. And then I started to try to look for ways that I could progress that over time. And the infinity hover was one I came up with when I was trying to see like how can I change this to be a more complex task for my higher level individuals, and having the unilateral opposite directions was a good way that I could then add on an extra layer of skill to it, or an extra layer of motor demand, where it's not just about producing more force, but you have a higher level of control demand in it. So I actually don't give that a lot to swimmers.
Now, when we talk about injury prevention, or should I say managing the risk of injury, when it comes to a structured program, how do you start trying to manage it if it's a healthy individual per se?
So are we talking about like a straight workout program, or?
Yeah, obviously I've seen that you love utilizing the single arm or single leg variations of things. Uh, Anything other than that, and obviously volume and load that come into play?
Yeah, so I think whenever we're looking at developing a program, the best thing that we can do is try to figure out where this person's current starting point is, and then start to develop off of that. And that's going to be probably one of the hardest things in my opinion, because a lot of times people are just given like a standardized dose and assume that that's the right thing. And that can be a standardized dose either in the exercise selection or an exercise actual volume, intensity, etc. There was a recent study that came out that was looking at how can we get better outcomes, and they were looking at comparing just a straight standard prescription versus a individualized prescription where they actually took what the person had been doing previously and then prescribed based off that volume. And so they actually just split the person in half, and they had them do one leg with a standard 22 set prescription, whereas the other side, they said how many these were actually trained individuals, which is fantastic. And they took how much training volume they'd been doing on their side per average in a week, and then they actually took 20% of that and added it on. So they had the one side, everyone in the study did 22 sets on the one side, and then everyone got a unique customized load based off what they had been doing previously on their other side. And what was cool is, everyone in that study did get better. Everyone got a little bit stronger. Everyone got a little bit more hypertrophy on both sides. But on the side that got the individualized prescription, they got better almost consistently across the entire study. Almost every person got better on that individualized side. And what's even cooler about it is that when you look at the individualized side, there were people that had been doing less than 22 sets per week. Like there were some people that were as low as, I think, like 8 sets per week. And then there was other people that were up to like 30 sets per week. And so even when they had been either lower or higher or just around that, they saw better improvement when it was taken into account their most recent history of training and then adjusted for. So for me, one of the things that I try to do with people is figure out like, what have you been doing previously? And then how can I adjust to match that to the best degree? Instead of just giving you a standard prescription. So when I'm working with people, I want to know as much detail as possible. What have you been doing previously so that I can start to manipulate things within a reasonable change instead of just giving you a general program, because you are more likely to have better outcomes if I can make it as closely individualized to your needs. And that's going to be number one, like exercise selection. So, for novices, we're going to utilize movements where they don't have as much of a skill demand, and that way they can have a higher emphasis on just getting the general abilities down, getting some actual biomotor development, and then less of a highly complex skill. So for instance, like in the squat spectrum of things, utilizing a goblet squat over an overhead squat. That goblet squat is going to be less complex. They'll be set up for more inherent success, and they can focus on just doing the task. Whereas with the overhead squat, the person is going to be struggling with more variables. There's a lot of different task constraints, and the person will then likely have less successful outcomes. And then when I'm, looking at different variables like volume and intensity, utilizing something like an RPE or RTF or RIR, so something where the person gets to utilize their own exertion as a scale, is shown to be better in most of the literature than utilizing like a straight intensity recommendation, because people are highly variable from how they can do higher rep work, how they can do lower rep work. So if I give you something where it's based off your own effort belief, then you're going to likely be more successful with it, especially when we start to add in changing in days, changing in weeks, and how you currently are stressed. Like on days where you feel better, I'm cool that you're going to push a little bit harder as long as it stays within that exertion level. Whereas on days where you feel awful, then you don't have as much of an expectation that you hit a certain weight, because now you're just matching an exertion level. And then with volume, most people are going to probably respond well to somewhere between 10 and 25 sets per week for most motor movements or muscle group challenges. And that's a pretty big range. Like if you think 10 to 25, that's the difference between doing like 3 sets a day or 2 sets a day for 5 days a week, or doing 5 sets per day for 5 days a week. So that's a pretty big range. And for a lot of people, I try to gear towards the lower end, see how they respond, see the kind of feedback they give me, and then increase week to week until I find them giving more reports to me that they're either feeling really beat up or they're feeling like they can't tolerate the load for some other way. And then we respond, and I keep marks and notes about these different people so that I know what I can push them to, and then respond in the following phases to less of a volume. Like, if we take you as an example, we started out at a set load, a set number of sets per week that I was like, okay, this should be a reasonable amount that he will be challenged with. And then each week we increased sets, we increased exertion. I kept notes about that. And then I took your notes at the end of the week, adjusted the following week so that it'd be, progressively more challenging. And then I looked to see how you respond by week 3. And if you say, oh man, this kicked my butt, I am now feeling it, it's like, okay, cool. We'll go into week 4. We'll reduce overall so you can compensate and feel ready for the next phase. And then in week 3 of the next phase, I'll aim to get to about those same metrics. But if you didn't report any of that, you're like, yeah, I feel great. I don't need to deload. Well, then in the next phase, I'm going to push you even harder. I'm going to take those variables to a higher extent. I'm going to give you more volume. I'm going to give you more intensity, something, so that you start to report those things. So I find what is your maximum recoverable volume that you can tolerate.
Now, when you look at the exertion that people are telling you that they prescribe for a certain set. What do you do when people aren't very efficient at it? Meaning, if someone, obviously you can watch a lot of other people trying to teach you how to use RPE, and they're talking about movement velocity, but I know from a couple of guys that I train and me as well, I'm a big grinder, meaning whenever I squat, once the bar almost loses all speed, I can usually bang out about 5 more reps. How do you handle people who say don't really know how to handle the system well?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is that when I'm starting people off, something that I like to do if they have completely no experience with it, I don't do this like in the first week. I might not do it in the second week. I might not do it in the third week. I might not do it in the first phase. It really depends upon this person's training experience. But if someone is a little bit more experienced, like they have, time in the gym where they've challenged themselves, and I know that they have a lower likelihood of getting injured, I'm gonna have them take sets to failure. That way they can start to experience it. It gives them an anchor point of like, what does RPE 8 mean? When am I a few reps short of failure? And in a lot of cases, when I'm looking at most of the research on this, if someone can't tell the difference between RPE 8 and 9, it's not a huge deal. I would sooner than be a bit more on the conservative side of RPE 8 than 9 in most cases, but most of the physiological changes don't matter. So as long as someone is like reasonably close and reasonably in that realm, I'm okay with it. But if someone is RPE 9 versus RPE 5, like we need to address that. And anchoring someone by having them go to failure is a good option. So a lot of the times I'll have people, like if this is someone who is, they've got maybe 6 months to a year of training experience, I'll have them do the first week, just get generally comfortable with the movements. I'll give them an RPE or RTF prescription, and I'll just say like, go experience it, see what it feels like. I don't need you to take anything to failure, just report back to me. Week 2, repeat. Week 3, I want you to take your last set to failure. That way you get a better idea of what it actually feels like and how accurate you were. I actually do this a lot with females because, at least in my experience, a lot of female trainees don't know what it actually feels like to grind out reps. I think a lot of guys inherently go into the gym and grind out a lot more reps, whereas a lot of females tend to not do that as much. And that's like within the weightlifting population, especially. Like I've got probably 3 females I'm coaching right now, and all of them, when I first started with them, had little to no idea of their RPE exertion. I had one lady that was telling me that she's a more experienced girl. She's in the 75 kilo class, or 72 now, and she can snatch almost 100 kilos, so she's very strong. And she was telling me that she was challenged with 120 kilos in the front squat for a triple, and I was like, there's no way, like you can clean 125, like 120 shouldn't be this hard for you. And I told her to take her last set to failure after we'd been working together for a month, and she ended up doing 6 reps. And she was telling me it was like an RPE 9 or 10. She thought it was for sure the max she could do. And then she almost did double that set. So for a lot of people, the thing that I like to do is just like give them some sort of reference point. And since most of the time going to true failure is going to end up like heavily fatiguing you or creating a lot of challenge for you to be able to perform multiple or repeated bouts, I usually just have people do it as like the last set of an exercise, and usually after they've had a bout of time to get accommodated to it. Because the other part is, like if you have someone try and get some sort of like anchor point, but they're new to a movement, it could heavily change as they start to get the actual just basics of the skill down. Like if you have someone go and they've never done a rear foot elevated split squat, they're just, they're a weightlifter or powerlifter who is very much used to just doing bilateral based movements, and then you have them do a rear foot elevated split squat, and then you ask them to do some sort of like set to failure in the first week, they could be incredibly stronger with that movement after a couple of weeks of just doing it. And so instead, just like having them go to some sort of like challenging load, that's the term that I often utilize when someone's just like, well, how hard should it be? And I just say, I just want it to feel challenging. Like whatever that means to you, as long as at the end you're like, yeah, that's a set. Like if you believe that and it's an RPE 5, whatever. Like in the grand scheme of things, how much does it matter for 1 or 2 weeks? I don't know. Probably not a ton. But at least I know that you're like getting comfortable with the movement. It's somewhat challenging. And then by the, a few weeks later, when we can actually push you to failure, you're going to know what you're doing then. So that's my approach.
Yeah, if I can add a similar story to yours, I had a client doing RDLs, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and I asked him to do anywhere between 8 and 15 reps wherever he felt he's at an RP 8. He finished with 12, I think, but it looked a little strange. So I told him, just take the last set to failure. He did like 30 reps until his grip gave out before anything else.
Yeah, and that is super common, especially when someone has no experience with legitimately grinding out a rep.
Yeah. Now, when you were talking about your 20-minute, 15-minute warm-up, do you think there's somewhere of law of diminishing returns there, where you do too much of like activation stuff or mobility stuff before? I know that there are a lot of coaches fetishizing around like 40 minutes and taking up a long time from their client's personal training session just for the warm up.
Yeah, so again, that was a comparison to me squatting 200 kilos for multiple reps. If you ask me right now to just, come in and snatch 70 kilos, as a reference point for anyone listening, I can snatch just under 140 kilos. So essentially that's around like 50% for me. I would go through a warm-up routine that would probably take me about 5-ish minutes, get onto the bar, and then start going through bar reps and bar complexes to then get up to 70 kilos. I'd probably be there within like 8 to 10 minutes. So it wouldn't take very long. For me, I think that there is the spectrum of people right now where you have either the hardcore extremists who think that you need to do every single stretch, every single activation exercise, and every single prehab possible thing that exists. And it does. It can extend into like 40 plus minutes. In contrast, I think that we've now started to see these extremists on the other end who think that you don't need to do anything beyond just get right into the exercise. And I don't think that either is inherently wrong, but there's probably a better spot somewhere in the middle. And I just had this conversation recently with a few friends about, why do you train? And that kind of should dictate your warm up. Like if you are a incredibly highly competitive power lifter and all you're looking for in life is to be better at powerlifting, well, you probably don't need to do a lot of things other than go in and start with the bar. Like you don't need to have a lot of variability. You don't need to have a lot of these other capacities beyond just squatting, benching, deadlifting. You're a weightlifter. You compete at the Olympics. You are a legitimate Olympic weightlifter. You probably don't need to do anything more than snatch, clean and jerk, squat, whatever. Like maybe having a little bit to keep you having fun, sure. But otherwise, you don't need a lot of variability. In contrast, I like to go and do other things. I like to go and hike. I like to go and play pickup basketball. I like to go and do wake surfing. I want to be able to be resilient to these other demands beyond just the snatch and clean and jerk. And so for me, incorporating movements in my warm up is an easy spot to get that because, if I include some things like thoracic rotation, hip rotation, some of these things that are going to probably be at least somewhat beneficial for my actual movements I'm going to do that day, but also allow me to have a greater ability and a greater range of movement capacity for when I go out into life and do these other things, well, that's pretty awesome. I would sooner have that. And the majority of people, I think, are in that spectrum. I don't think most people are professional powerlifters or professional weightlifters, and instead are just someone that is like a hobbyist that enjoys that as their main training method, and is probably beneficial to have a few minutes per day where they do some things that are non-specific to that, because that will likely set them up for better success down the road, in my opinion.
Okay. Now, I also wanted to talk to you about pain fluctuations with your patients, specifically the general population that they usually hope to see or expect to see, like linear progress. How do you usually handle that?
So the first thing is that when I start working with someone, I set expectations. It's one of the first things we do in my intake form. I have people fill this out when we start working together, and it asks you, like, what are you expecting? What are the things that you view as success? What are the things that you view as desirable outcomes? People usually put something about pain on there, but a lot more often people are putting other things. And, like if I'm working with someone, they're reporting, hey, I have shoulder pain and it's really crappy and it's limiting me from work. I'm an electrician. I can't be able to do any overhead work right now. I need some sort of solution. And we start to figure out these options. And over time, let's say like the first few weeks, their shoulder is making improvements in function and it's also making reductions in pain. But then they have a flare up. Well, then one of the things that I like to do is look at the sheet, look at the things that they were desiring as improvements, and return back to those things. And that way we know, like, okay, well, yeah, pain sucks. It's going to be this thing that pops up every now and then. We can't necessarily predict it, but you are able to do all these other things that you weren't able to do at the start and you wanted to be able to get back to. And usually that helps to have people calm down and remind themselves of the improvement they've made. Because a lot of the time, I think people get set into like a structural mindset that, like I have this like set damage, I have this set issue wrong with me, and I'm not going to be able to get, number one, a reduction in pain, but also improvement in the ability to return back to these meaningful activities. And it's harder to have a lot of control over pain, but we can have a lot more control over someone getting back to meaningful activities. And when people see that they're able to do that, it often helps them calm down and catastrophize less. Stop thinking that something is so inherently wrong with them. That's a big one for me. And then I also provide a lot of education because I know knowledge on a lot of this stuff. Like I know the likelihood of some sort of sinister pathology. I know the information about how relevant different tissue is. I know a lot of that. So as a physical therapist, I'm able to provide a lot of that education and also put it into context. I think that's one thing that a lot of the times the evidence-based people get crapped on a lot because, like we'll apparently downplay some of these different things. But for me, when I'm providing the education about like the likelihood of a disc herniation to a patient, I'm able to create an analogy of how likely it is that someone else would have one that doesn't have pain. And oftentimes that makes a better connection than just like giving them a random number. And being able to do that in a lot of different cases seems to help people be less concerned about pain. And as you start to provide a little bit more tidbits along the way, working with people to kind of like give them a new reference point on what pain means, they usually start to be less fearful about it. If there's anything that I feel very proud of with working with my patients, is that when we're done treatment, they might not be pain-free, but they tell me that they don't feel like they need to be treated anymore. And that they feel like they have solutions now to be able to manage their pain. They feel like they have the confidence to not need someone and that they're going to be okay down the line. And a lot of times when I'm done my care, so like the actual time that I'm expecting to be paid for before I discharge, the person is likely not pain-free. but they've made improvements. They're getting back to activities, and they have a plan. And then for me, I check in later with all patients. I like to do a follow-up, and when I check in with people, they report better and better outcomes as we go further and further in time. And people often tell me about how much the understanding about these different things helps them in so many different avenues, because I think we live in a society where pain is so negatively viewed. Like if you have pain, something is wrong, something is very bad, and it's just a part of life. And when you can start to frame that to people, it can often be very relieving, especially if someone is like higher anxiety. My wife has anxiety conditions, and so for her, when we first met, she was someone where like if she had an ache or a pain of any kind, she would immediately go and see a practitioner. And for her now, like she will have some sort of issue pop up, some sort of pain, and instead of like rushing to go see someone or to even ask me, like I'm in the house, she could easily ask me. She doesn't. She'll wait and see how it responds, which has been like a drastic change for her. And not only is that more relieving on her because now she doesn't have to like rush to see people, but it also is a huge reduction in the medical system, because now like she's not rushing to go see a doctor who, if he were to do anything, would be inappropriate, but also now doesn't have to calm her down and have an appointment filled up that's just unnecessary. And so seeing these kind of changes are the things that like I think is awesome. And a huge part of it comes down to being able to explain to someone the basics of pain. Like I don't go into the nitty-gritty details and explain like nociceptive pain or anything like that. It's just about like framing when someone may have had pain in the past and it wasn't a big deal, and how they just like naturally get better. And just having different examples like a paper cut, stubbing your toe, being outside in the cold, all these kinds of things help to explain to someone so that they can frame, just like when we were talking about before, when you give someone like a framing, like an anchor set to be able to understand failure. I give someone a framing point to start to understand their pain, and that can be very beneficial and really heavily reduce someone's catastrophizing.
Funnily enough, it's kind of referencing the first episode of the podcast with John Flagg, where we talked about that people who are training need to sort of expect pain. I mean, not totally embracing it and thinking it's completely normal, but just expecting it. It's something that's going to happen in your training journey.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that there are things outside of training people can do, obviously, other than managing sleep? The thing that I want to focus more on is nutrition, like being in a calorie deficit, whether or not it affects things.
I don't think that there's any literature necessarily saying specifically that a calorie deficit or calorie surplus or anything like that is inherently beneficial for pain. But I do know that there's a lot of literature showing us that people that have more complex medical issues or more comorbidities, so for instance, if someone has diabetes or if someone has coronary atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, any of those kinds of things, it increases that person's likelihood of experiencing pain. And in the majority of cases, those people are overweight. And so inherently, we likely are beneficial to be in a caloric deficit for different periods of time if we are overweight, and it's probably going to be advantageous for us possibly from a pain and disability standpoint, but I don't know if there's any specific literature on that. I know that when they show longitudinal data on people that have arthritis and when those people have weight management strategies implemented, and that's a general statement, so that could be exercise, it could be nutrition, all sorts of things. When those people reduce weight, they have an improvement in function and a reduction in pain. So, like a caloric restriction is a viable option for a lot of that, but I don't think that there's any specific literature on that. Other things, though, there's a ton of stuff that people can do. that can be beneficial for reducing pain. Like there are so many different things out there that are shown. They're just not really discussed a lot because, exercise is gradually becoming sexier. Previously manual therapy was super hot. Modalities are
Yeah.
always in and out. But there are things like journaling and affirmations that have been shown to be beneficial, changing in mindset, changing your social networks, the people that you spend time around. There's literature showing that when you are around more people, that actually, it's very interesting because we think about like when people are alcoholics and they spend time around alcoholics, if those people are alcoholics who are currently in a bout of alcoholism, they are more likely to be to return back to being an alcoholic and start drinking again. We have some similar literature about people that are in pain. When people are in a high degree of disability and spend more time around other people who have a high degree of disability, that will likely become a vicious cycle and continue to repeat. Whereas if you are someone that has a high degree of disability and you were to go into a different social network, you likely will reduce your disability, which will impact your pain. Participating in general physical activity, being outdoors. This obviously, like, COVID is a crappy time, but the literature on being outdoors shows us that when people spend more time in nature, they actually are more likely to have a reduction in pain. So there's just like so many different things. It's just not a lot of people talk about it, unfortunately.
I gotcha.
And sleep is a
Now,
big one.
yeah, obviously. Um, Now, the next couple of questions is what I really want to close with, and it's sort of getting your hot takes on a couple of things. One of them sort of shouting out the unofficial episode of the first episode of the podcast that was with Chad Dolan. I don't know if you know who that is. In any case, we were talking about isometrics, and he mentioned something about it being something productive for rehab. And from there, what I was thinking is what we know that when you do an isometric exercise, there are certain degrees of both flexion and extension of said joint that is also strengthened, right? I wanted to ask, what do you think about implementing something like an isometric a couple of degrees shy of the actual pain response to strengthen the range of motion that actually gives us pain?
Yeah, that's totally cool. From like a research standpoint, the majority of time we don't see anything really special about isometrics over isotonic, like concentric and eccentric exercises. The biggest difference is that a lot of the times when we think about like what is an isometric, it is a contraction where there's no velocity. And so that is a big one. There are different structures in our body that don't necessarily respond to a high rate of change. So, for instance, a highly irritable tendon might not like a fast rate of change, particularly when it's in a highly compressed position. So, you could utilize an isometric right before a highly compressed position to try and introduce load and then gradually build it up. Like, that's actually something that I do personally as a therapist. If I have a weightlifter who has a high degree of anterior knee pain that I think is, tendon related, I'll take them down. I'll have them perform an isometric in a position just above where their pain really starts to kick in, and we'll just start there. However, if someone can tolerate going through isotonic motions, then I usually preference that because I don't think that the tendon inherently knows the difference. So, isometrics are pretty cool. They can be helpful in a lot of ways. There's some literature showing that from like a standpoint of changing rate of force development, using them at different lengths can be beneficial. For instance, like if I want someone to be able to produce a high rate of velocity at a long muscle length, doing an isometric at a long muscle length can do that. So for athletes that have to be able to produce that for certain things, it can be really beneficial. For instance, I've worked with a few baseball pitchers and a few volleyball players. And so for them, they have to be in a very lengthened position with their when they go back in that layback position. So it really lengthens out their internal rotators. And so for them to be able to produce a lot of velocity, so a high rate of change, will perform isometrics in that very lengthened position. But from a pain standpoint, I don't know if it really like it's a fine way to introduce loading. It's a fine means to start to do it, but I don't think it's anything special.
So more of a tool with more control, so to speak.
Yeah, it can definitely like, as you start to add constraints, so, you're not moving, it's a constraint. You have more control, more constraints, more control.
Gotcha. And the second thing was coming from a guy who was a teenager obsessed with bodybuilding and isolation exercises, turned into a strength enthusiast and sort of hating bicep curls. Recently, I kind of turned around after seeing the programs you put out with E3 Rehab for single joint exercises for either prehab or rehab for sort of neglected joint stuff like the calf raises I told you I recently introduced for the ankle that I haven't done in like 6 years.
Yeah, like building off that exact point we just had about isometrics being good because you have more control. It's a very similar aspect of where we add a constraint. You're only having one joint move. You have to use that muscle group. And like a good example, for instance, is doing knee extension. When someone squats, there is a good chance they're loading their quads. It's really hard to perform a squat and not use your quads at all. However, the degree to which you use them is incredibly variable. And whereas like if I want someone to load their quads, if I have them do a knee extension, they have literally no choice. They have to use them. That is the only way to extend their knee when they're in that position. So same thing with like if I have a person that I want to have a stronger calf, having them do calf raises is a guarantee it will work. Same with like the bicep, doing bicep curls. If someone has a limitation in their bicep and we need to develop it, you could do rows, you can do pull downs. Oh, we good?
Yeah, wait. Yeah, there was I don't know what was the issue there.
Yeah, and just same with the bicep. If someone has a limitation in their bicep, we can do pull downs, we can do rows, we can do all these different things that will work the bicep. But if we look at it from a biomechanical standpoint and we look at it from an EMG standpoint, the usage of the bicep will be way higher if we just do a curl. So if we deem that any of these muscles, and it can be for anything, if we want it to be challenged, we can do it in compound movements, but it might not be a guarantee that it gets challenged. Whereas if you do an isolation type movement, it will get worked. And, I don't run and jump to these things unless someone like, if I'm working with someone that wants to get yoked, I'll probably have them do some bicep curls because it's going to work. Whereas like if I have someone who comes to me and they have, a biceps tendinopathy and I want to load their bicep, I might not rush into doing a bicep curl. I might start off with some loading if this person has never done any type of bicep movement. I might start off with a row or some other variation that's going to be able to introduce that demand. And then over time, I can start to get to a more specific form of loading as I need to. And so isolation movements can be really valuable. And it's just about like the context that you start to utilize them. They're not inherently better, but again, as you start to layer on like critical thinking, they can directly challenge what you want to challenge when that's the goal.
All right. I think that gets us sort of covered with everything that I've planned on asking. So if you could just tell other people where can they reach out to you or contact you outside of obviously something like this?
Yeah. So if people want to reach out, they can do that either on Instagram. That's probably the easiest option. If you
Yep.
want to contact me by email, you can shoot me an email at thestrengththerapist@gmail.com. Otherwise, I check my Instagram. I check my DMs. What's up? Come on out. That's about it.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.